A velvet tray, a gloved hand, a diamond just slightly tilted to catch the light. The room is silent, except for the soft click of a camera and the sharper one of a display case being locked. On a linen covered podium nearby, the Sotheby's catalog lies open. It states, quote, Star of the South, 128.48 carats, private European collection circa 19th century. But that's not true. Someone knew more than that. Someone took it, and someone made sure that what came next was quiet. Welcome to This Again. I'm your host, Mallory Faust, and today we're telling a different kind of crime story. Not the kind with red lasers and ski masks, but the kind where history itself is the target. This episode isn't just about a single diamond, though. Yes, we will start there, but it's about how artifacts become trophies, how memory becomes merchandise, in the quiet, calculated ways that power gets to decide what counts as heritage and what gets left off the label. So, who gets to own history? This is the Historical Heists episode. So, let's rewind and let's get into it. If I told you one of the largest and rarest diamonds in the world just disappeared, like full on vanished, with no one held accountable, you'd probably assume it was a Hollywood script. But this happened in real life, in post colonial India, and somehow it involves a rebellious royal, a cover up so messy it could make a politician sweat, and a diamond that quietly resurfaces decades later, sparkling on a velvet cushion in a European auction house. It's past sanitized, it's theft unresolved. This is a story about a jewel, but more so, it's a story about history. Who gets to own it, rewrite it, and display it behind the glass? And if that reminds you of some recent museum controversies where countries are finally asking for their looted artifacts back, hold that thought, because we're going to go there. But first, let me take you to Baroda. During the height of British colonial rule in India, the princely state of Baroda, now part of Gujarat, stood out as one of the richest and most extravagantly adorned regions in the subcontinent. Ruled by the Gaikwad dynasty in the early 18th century until 1949, Baroda had all the trappings of imperial wealth: palaces, private armies, and treasure vaults that reportedly brimmed with gold, gemstones, and enough pearls to string around the equator. But what truly set the Gaikwads apart were their jewels. Nothing compared to the jewels. Among the crown jewels of Baroda were two stunners: the Star of the South, which was a pale pink diamond weighing 128.48 carats, discovered in Brazil in 1853. It entered in the Gaikwad treasury in the 1860s and is still regarded as one of the most famous colored diamonds ever mined. And then there's the English Dresden, a flawless 76.5 carat cushion cut white diamond, likely cut in India and worn by multiple generations of the Gaikwad dynasty in ceremonial regalia. These weren't just royal baubles, they were physical symbols of sovereignty, legacy, and elite status, so valuable and so politically loaded that by the mid 20th century, they would become the centerpieces of one of the most mysterious jewel disappearances in modern history. Which brings us to her. You know how some people are born to be tabloid legends? Sita Devi was one of them. She wasn't the Gaikwad's first wife, she was the second. And she didn't tiptoe into royal life. She blew the doors right off it. She was bold, glamorous, defiant, and determined to live on her own terms. And after marrying Maharaja Pratap Singh Gaikwad, against the wishes of just about everyone, she became known as India's Wallace Simpson. And much like her Western counterpart, she quickly became a symbol of scandal and excess. But make no mistake, Sita Devi wasn't just a socialite. She was a strategist. And when India gained independence in 1947 and the old royal families started losing their titles, incomes, and special privileges, Sita Devi wasn't about to go down with the system. In 1949, just 2 years after independence, the Indian government began auditing the princely state's finances. The Gaikwad of Baroda, Pratap Singh, was immediately flagged for suspicious spending. Among the concerns? Over $10 million in personal expenditures charged to the state. In today's money, by the way, that's upwards of a couple of $100 million. But the audit uncovered something even more explosive. The royal treasury had been quietly emptied. And not just gold coins or bars, jewels were missing. Multiple historic pieces, including the Star of the South, had been removed without permission, documentation, or taxation. Witnesses later testified that the Maharani herself had taken the jewels, disguised as personal belongings, and spirited them away during a trip to Europe. Just picture that, a royal retreat cloaked in furs and diamonds, slipping past customs with a treasure trove of India's cultural history stuffed into her Louis V carry-ons. Sita Devi didn't sneak the jewels out in the dead of night. She left India like royalty. Multiple reports confirm she declared the jewel as personal effects. There were no seizures, no official protests at the airport, no charges were filed. Not because no one noticed, but because no one quite knew what to do. The paperwork was vague. The laws around royal inheritance were still evolving. And the idea of prosecuting a former queen in the early days of Indian democracy felt radioactive. And so she left, with trunks full of heirlooms, with national treasures draped in velvet. And within weeks, she was being photographed on the French Riviera wearing what may have once been the property of the people of Baroda. It wasn't a heist in a cinematic sense. It was something worse. It was a disappearance that everyone watched, and no one stopped. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Who actually owned these jewels? According to the Gaikwads, the jewels were private property, part of the family's legacy, passed down through generations. According to the Indian government, they were state property, funded and protected by the people of Baroda, meaning Sita Devi had essentially looted the nation. No one could agree, and because the paperwork was either non-existent or deliberately vague, no one could prove anything. It was the perfect royal crime, too embarrassing to prosecute, too tangled to untangle, and too symbolic to ignore. While the Indian government was quietly panicking, Sita Devi was living her best life in Monaco and Paris. She partied with dukes and film stars. She posed for Life magazine wearing the stolen jewels. She had arrived at society galas in furs, dripping with diamonds that technically maybe weren't hers. But we don't know exactly what went on behind closed doors in Monte Carlo. The facts we do know paint a very specific picture. The Maharani was living in a beachfront suite at the Hotel de Paris with 5 Rolls Royces at her disposal and a full-time staff of 50. She shopped at Dior, dined with diplomats, and was photographed by Life magazine, dripping in the very jewels the Indian government claimed she had no right to possess. So, while we can't say what she was thinking, we can almost see it. Picture her on the balcony at golden hour, cocktail in one hand, silk robe catching the sea breeze. The Star of the South is glinting at her neck. Not as a symbol of India's royal past, but as her personal accessory. She wasn't hiding. She never had, because maybe that was the strategy all along, to dazzle so brightly no one would dare ask where the light was coming from. There are even reports that she had a custom 7-strand pearl necklace restrung because she didn't like the spacing. That's not just luxury, that's power. And it raised a question no one really wanted to answer. If a stolen artifact becomes someone's accessory, does anyone still care about the theft? That question didn't die in 1949. It's alive today in museum basements, in restitution lawsuits, in uncomfortable debates over heritage and power, because what Sita Devi did with the Gaikwad jewels, it's not so different from what colonial powers did to thousands of artifacts now sitting in glass cases in the world's most prestigious institutions. And if you think there's a clean answer to who gets to claim history, wear it, or display it for profit, well, this next part might change your mind. When news broke that the Gaikwad of Baroda had misused state funds and his wife had possibly smuggled historic jewels out of India, the scandal was so damning it could have toppled reputations, rewritten laws, and sparked a national reckoning. But that's not what happened. Instead, the story was slowly and meticulously buried. because the jewels weren't the only things that had gone missing. Accountability had too. So, to set the scene here, India was newly independent, barely 2 years into being a republic. The country was trying to unify hundreds of former princely states, stabilize its currency, and navigate a post British identity crisis. The last thing the prime minister needed was a humiliating scandal involving a royal theft, luxury diamonds, and international embarrassment. And so the response was careful. Too careful. Pratap Singh Gaikwad was technically removed from power, but not imprisoned. He was given a generous pension and allowed to live in comfort, and the investigations into Sita Devi's jewels quietly fizzled. A few parliamentary inquiries were launched and then conveniently tabled. The jewels were gone. The trail had gone cold, and no one seemed eager to chase it. So, like I said before, Sita Devi wasn't exactly hiding. Her apartment overlooked the Mediterranean. She traveled with a 50-person entourage and wore her jewels openly to balls, fashion shows, and Vogue spreads. Let me say that again. The woman accused of smuggling priceless national artifacts was literally being photographed wearing them on yachts. And the world ate it up. She wasn't a fugitive. She was a mystique, a style icon, a whispered legend. There's a reason people didn't riot over Sita Devi's diamonds. In fact, most people didn't even raise an eyebrow because the moment she stepped into a Dior gown, leaned into the lens, and posed with stolen treasure like it was just a statement piece, she wasn't a thief. She was fascinating. Psychologists call this narrative reframing. When the facts of a situation become easier to digest if they feel like fiction, her life looked like a movie, and movies aren't crimes, they're entertainment. Add in a dash of status bias, the idea that wealth and beauty must equal competence, and suddenly no one wants to ask, should she have that diamond? We didn't just let her tell the story, we wanted her to. And in that glittering contradiction lies something important. Visibility was actually her shield. She probably knew the jewels couldn't be reclaimed without someone asking uncomfortable questions about where they came from and why no one had stopped her. So she seemingly made sure they were always in plain sight. It was audacious, brazen, and weirdly familiar because this is the same trick pulled by institutions that display looted artifacts under soft museum lights. Turn the theft into a feature, label it as preservation, reframe history as curation, and hope no one asks where the object was before the display case. Let's talk about the British Museum for a second. You probably know it's under constant fire for refusing to turn dozens, if not hundreds, of artifacts taken during colonialization. From the Benin bronzes to the Parthenon marbles, the museum's stance is complicated. It often sounds like this. Quote, we're protecting these items. Quote, they're safer here. Quote, returning them would set a dangerous precedent. But critics argue you're normalizing conquest. You're rewriting history through possession, and you're using stolen heritage to boost cultural capital. Now, apply that same logic to Sita Devi. She took jewels claimed as family heirlooms, but steeped in national identity and historical significance, and wore them in a way that said, these are mine now, not just physically, but narratively. And the world didn't just let her, it celebrated her. What makes an artifact valuable? Not just the materials, not even the craftsmanship. It's the story, where it came from, who made it, what it symbolizes. And the moment someone else claims the story, whether it's a museum, a monarch, or a runaway royal, it gets rewritten. That's what happened here. Sita Devi didn't just steal a diamond, she hijacked its history. And because no one wanted to challenge her too directly, because the optics were bad and the politics were messy and the evidence is too slippery, she got away with it. The Gaikwad scandal slowly dissolved into legend. The jewels were never returned, and by the 1970s, the world had largely moved on. In the decades that followed, India continued pushing for accountability around looted and smuggled cultural items. But it wasn't just the government leading the charge. Historians, lawyers, and everyday citizens began to ask harder questions, like how many treasures were lost during partition and independence? What responsibility do institutions have to return stolen cultural property? And how do we reconcile luxury with legacy? when the same jewel can mean freedom to one person and loss to another. Meanwhile, other countries started to reckon with these questions too. In 2022, Germany returned over 1,100 Benin bronzes to Nigeria. These were taken by British forces in a brutal 1897 raid. Germany's gesture was one of the largest acts of restitution in modern European history. The Smithsonian recently adopted a policy to return artifacts that were, quote, acquired under unethical circumstances. This includes looted objects and those taken during colonial occupation. France also returned 26 treasures to Benin in 2021, with President Macron declaring that Africa's heritage, quote, must not be held prisoner in European museums. These aren't just symbolic acts, they're public admissions that owning an artifact doesn't mean you own its history, and these stories are starting to crack through the display cases. In 2023, a 500-year-old statue of Hindu goddess Durga was returned to India from a museum in the UK. It had been stolen in the 1960s, plucked from a village temple, smuggled through private dealers, and eventually acquired by a prestigious institution. For decades, it sat in a pristine white room behind glass. The placard read, quote, Goddess Durga, origin unknown, acquired 1983. That's what cultural theft sounds like when it's dressed up for donors. And when the statue was finally returned, after years of pressure from Indian activists and investigative journalists, it wasn't just welcomed home, it was reblessed. Not as a trophy, as a spiritual object, as part of a living culture. That one return didn't fix everything, but it closed a wound, at least a little. And here's the good news, sort of. In the past decade, there has been a noticeable shift. Museums and governments are finally being forced to ask the question they avoided for a century. Do we actually have the right to keep this? The 1970 UNESCO Convention set the tone, but the real movement has come from public pressure and independent investigations. These aren't just goodwill gestures, they're cracks in a very old wall. A quiet acknowledgement that owning history without context or consent was never preservation. It was power parading as care. By the 2000s, something strange happened. The Star of the South reappeared. Not in India or a museum, but in a Sotheby's auction catalog. The same diamond that vanished in a smuggled luggage case had quietly resurfaced, now attached to vague documentation in a new provenance. The official line? It had, quote, passed through private hands. No mention of Sita Devi, no mention of Baroda, and certainly no mention of India. Just a price tag. The artifact was clean. The story was gone, and just for a moment, let's picture it. A sleek, climate-controlled showroom at Sotheby's in Geneva. The Star of the South gleaming under glass, soft pink, impossibly clear, cradled in a platinum setting. The catalog describes it with words like timeless and exceptional, there's champagne being poured, sharp suits, discreet nods from anonymous buyers. No one mentions the Gaikwads. No one says the word India. There's no footnote about the 1949 scandal, no hint that this gem was once the subject of an international cover-up. The bidding starts at a whopping $5 million. It ends over 10. The gavel falls, and there's applause. And just like that, the diamond has a new owner, a new legacy. The old one, messy, royal, stolen, it's just simply gone, erased from the label and left off the receipt. Scholars have long argued that history isn't something you inherit, it's something you curate. And the person who gets to do the curating, that's the person who holds the artifact. There's even a name for this kind of soft power, cultural patrimony. The belief that certain objects aren't just valuable, they're sacred, tied to memory, to identity, to national or spiritual meaning. But when the patrimony gets housed in the wrong place, behind the wrong narrative, it stops being heritage and starts being a hostage. When objects pass through enough hands, especially powerful ones, their backstories get massaged, sanitized, and forgotten. And this is how colonial loot becomes collection pieces, how museum artifacts labeled as acquisitions were actually ripped from war zones and burial grounds, how cultural heritage gets scrubbed of pain until all that's left is the beauty. In that Sotheby's catalog, the Star of the South is listed simply as a rare and exceptional colored diamond. And sure, it very much is that. But it's also a symbol of a collapsing monarchy, a relic of colonial confusion, a national artifact smuggled out during the time of political upheaval, and arguably the centerpiece of one of the most expensive unresolved thefts in Indian history. But none of that was up for bidding, because auction houses are not arbiters of justice. They're storytellers of value, curators of prestige, not truth. And once the story is clean enough to sell, the truth no longer matters. This isn't just about a diamond, though. The Gaikwad scandal isn't just a niche royal drama. It's a blueprint for how we quietly let go of cultural loss. Because no one wants the fight. Not really. It's easier to let time blur the details, to let the auction go through, to tell ourselves that the jewel found a good home. The same way museums tell themselves they're protecting history, not hiding it. But the truth is, when something is taken unjustly and no one is held accountable, that's not just theft, it's a rewrite. And once the rewrite sets in, good luck getting the original back. And what happens next? The new owner, the buyer, can now claim something priceless as their own, with no moral friction. Because if it's in your possession, on your finger, or in your vault, or in your institution, and there's no one protesting outside, it must be yours now, right? Who gets to rewrite history? That question still echoes today, maybe louder than ever, because even as some governments move toward restitution and reparation, the institutions holding the most prized objects often resist. They insist that they're better equipped to care for these items, that everyone benefits from public access, and that sending things back opens a legal Pandora's box. But there's an unspoken truth underneath all that. Ownership isn't just about possession, it's about power. The power to control the story, to define legacy, to decide whose history matters. And the longer that power goes unchallenged, the more permanent the theft becomes. We're not just losing objects, we're losing context, we're losing memory, and memory is dangerous when it's in the wrong hands. So let's take a quick tour through today's display cases. Here's a brief roll call of treasures still in limbo. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, once worn by Mughal emperors and Maharajas, now sits in the British Crown Jewels, despite repeated requests by India for its return. In 2023, Queen Camilla's coronation crown did not feature the Koh-i-Noor, likely due to the political controversy. This omission was widely seen as a tacit acknowledgement of the tension around the diamond. The Rosetta Stone, key to deciphering ancient Egypt hieroglyphics, remains in the British Museum, though Egypt has called for its return. The Elgin marbles, hacked off the Parthenon in Greece in the early 1800s, are still held in London. Technically, the British Museum remains prohibited by law from permanently returning objects in its collection without an act of Parliament. Each one of these has a complex story, though, and they all also share a common trait. The party that took them also gets to decide what the public knows about them, just like Sita Devi did. Just like any empire that's learned it's easier to build a museum than to admit a crime. Now let's go to 1911, where the most famous painting in the world vanished. It didn't disappear under cover of night. It wasn't cut from its frame in a chaotic shootout or replaced with a forgery. The Mona Lisa was simply taken by a man in a janitor's coat. His name was Vincenzo Perugia, and his plan was as bold as it was simple. He wanted to take the painting home, literally back to Italy. Perugia was an Italian nationalist who believed the Mona Lisa had been stolen by Napoleon and that it rightfully belonged to the Italian people. He hid inside the Louvre overnight and slipped out with the painting tucked under his arm the next morning. He walked straight out of the museum. No alarms, no guards, no cameras, just him and the Mona Lisa. And here's the crazy part, it actually worked. For 2 years, no one knew where the painting had gone. Paris was in chaos over it. Art lovers mourned, conspiracy theories flew, and some people even accused Picasso. The Louvre shut down for a week. The theft made international headlines and turned what had once been a modestly appreciated Renaissance portrait into a global icon. And when Perugia was finally caught in 1913, after trying to sell the painting to a gallery in Florence, he wasn't exactly treated as a criminal. He was celebrated. People called him a patriot, a hero who tried to restore cultural pride. His sentence was 1 year and 15 days in prison. He served 7 months. We tend to think of art heists as glamorous or greedy. Think diamond thieves, red lasers, museum thrillers. But Perugia didn't do it for money. He did it for meaning. He believed he was reclaiming something sacred. And that makes this story a perfect mirror image of the heist we've just spent this episode unraveling. Because when Sita Devi smuggled the Star of the South and the English Dresden out of India, it wasn't framed as patriotism. It was a scandal. It was theft. It was tabloid fodder. No one called it restoration. No one offered reduced jail time in exchange for the jewels. The jewels weren't returned. Their legacy wasn't restored. Instead, the jewels became untethered from their history and then sold to the highest bidder. But when Perugia stole the Mona Lisa, the opposite happened. He added to the painting's history. His theft gave it a new weight, a new mystique. It became the story of nationalism and pride. His act, though illegal, became part of the cultural mythology of the painting. One theft erased history and the other cemented it. And maybe that's the real difference between a jewel in a drawer and a painting on a wall. One becomes a private trophy and the other becomes a public relic. But both are shaped by the stories we tell after the fact. So, who was the thief and what was their motive? What country claims ownership? Who gets to keep the artifact? Who gets to write the placard? Maybe the Mona Lisa wasn't just missing. Maybe she was reminding us of something, that heritage isn't permanent. It's portable. It can vanish in a moment. It can be carried under someone's coat or locked in a velvet case or quietly transferred decade after decade until we forget where it started. And if we don't pay attention to the stories we attach to those objects we treasure, someone else will. Someone always does. And that's probably why the Mona Lisa keeps showing up in protests, because she isn't just a painting anymore. She's a symbol, quite literally, a cultural shortcut. In May of 2022, a man disguised in a wheelchair smeared cake across the bulletproof glass that guards her, yelling, "Think of the Earth!" in a climate protest that instantly made headlines worldwide. In January 2024, two activists threw soup at the same protective shield to demand agricultural reform and environmental action. They weren't trying to destroy the painting, they were leveraging her power, because protesters know something the rest of us often forget. If you act in front of the Mona Lisa, the world will look. She's been the target of stunts, protests, and disruptions, not because she's controversial, but because she's culturally undeniable. The Mona Lisa doesn't just symbolize art anymore, she symbolizes attention, legacy, the fight to define what actually matters. So maybe the most iconic artifact in the world isn't famous because of what's on the canvas, she's famous because of everything that's happened around it: theft, return, obsession, spectacle, legacy by way of disruption. And speaking of disruption, just last month the Louvre was robbed again, but this time it wasn't a lone patriot. It wasn't a statement. It was something much colder, sharper, and perhaps more familiar than we'd like to admit. It was October 19th, 2025, and Paris was just waking up when it happened. At 9:31 a.m., two men in reflective construction gear pulled a box truck around to the Rue de Rivoli side of the Louvre, and they actually had permits and paperwork and radios. They even nodded at security as they unloaded scaffolding, like this was any other maintenance day, except it wasn't. Within minutes, they'd scaled the side of the Galerie des Palais, the room that houses France's historic crown jewels. Inside, century-old diamonds, sapphires, and enamel work, the spoils of empire, the legacy of Louis XIV. And by 9:39 a.m., those legacies were gone. The thieves used angle grinders, the same kind used in safecracking, and within 6 minutes, they had cut through the display case, grabbed 8 historic items, and then just disappeared. Gone in literal broad daylight in the morning, in the most visited museum on Earth. The estimated value was over 100 million US dollars. But the real value isn't in the dollar signs. It's in what was taken. Those weren't just random pieces of jewelry. They were narrative anchors, symbols of monarchy, nationhood, and cultural identity. One of the stolen pieces was the royal crown of Empress Eugenie, adorned with hundreds of diamonds. Another was the Sancy diamond, once belonging to both French and English royalty. They weren't just robbing a museum, they were stealing the story. Authorities shut the Louvre down for 2 full days. Interpol issued an emergency alert, and cultural ministers across Europe issued public statements calling the heist an attack on heritage. But here's the thing, there was no ransom note and no manifesto, no stated cause. This wasn't a Perugia situation. It wasn't political, it wasn't symbolic, it was simply seemingly transactional. And maybe that's what makes it feel so eerie and modern. In a time when cultural ownership is a global conversation, when countries are fighting to reclaim looted art, and when museums are quietly repatriating artifacts, when the public is finally asking hard questions about where all this heritage comes from, the thieves didn't wait for the debate. They just walked in and took it. Sita Devi was once asked, years after her exile, whether she regretted anything. She simply smiled and said, quote, "A woman is only truly dressed when she's wearing her memories." End quote. That's poetic and also wildly sinister. Because when your memories include national treasures that disappeared under diplomatic silence, it becomes clear this was never just about the jewels. It was about what the jewels could say and who got to tell the story. And that's the real theft, not just of diamonds, but of meaning, of identity, of collective memory. So, why does this dusty royal scandal from 1949 still hit a nerve? Because we're still living with the consequences of historical erasure. We still walk through museums filled with, quote, curated objects whose backstories have been filtered or forgotten. We still debate whether cultural restitution is symbolic or necessary. And we still let luxury and legacy excuse a whole lot of ugly truths. The Guy Quadrille scandal is a case study in how easily theft becomes heritage when no one wants to look too closely. It's also a warning that if we don't protect the meaning behind the things we treasure, we'll keep losing them, not just physically, but emotionally, narratively, and culturally. And one day, we'll wake up to find our history behind glass, labeled in someone else's language, curated by someone else's standards, and sold to the highest bidder. Now, you can't always get the diamond back, but you can tell the story of how it disappeared. And sometimes that's the most powerful form of justice we've got. Maybe history is a little like a diamond, not because it sparkles, because it fractures. Every cut, every facet, it reflects something different depending on where you stand. And the longer something is held in the wrong hands, the more distorted its reflection becomes. We like to think history is solid, permanent, objective, but it isn't. It's fragile. And the moment we stop asking, how did this get here, is the moment we lose the story forever. Thanks for listening to This Again. And while I have you, make sure to subscribe and send this to a friend who borrowed your favorite hoodie and still hasn't returned it. We'll see you next time.